Welcome back, everyone. Pal Ponder on Weather here with your morning update over the next 7 days. So let's take a look at the setup going forward. You can actually see in the North American view this morning, we've got this dominating ridge of high pressure depicted on this red shaded area. That's underneath that. They've got a lot of sinking air and these well above average temperature anomalies. Plenty of records have been unfolding almost on a daily basis. But to the north, we've got a fairly decent trough that's building across the upper Midwest. That's actually pushing southbound, and eventually that's going to bring a little bit of cooler conditions relief for portions of the south. But for today, we've got to be concerned about that southern periphery of that trough, and on the northern side of that ridge, that's the area of concern. We've had these convective complexes kind of blowing up and then traversing east southeastward and producing some very heavy rain, if not flooding rains. In fact, some flash flood emergencies this morning across portions of Kentucky. Those areas have been just hit hard over the last couple of hours, and now we see renewed development looks to take shape across that region. And looking at this, some of these rainfall totals, this is definitely starting to get concerning. So these storms kind of blew up across portions of southeastern Missouri with several inches of rainfall. This is already rainfall that has already fallen, and that continued east southeastbound. And there's a kind of a bullseye just set up south of Paducah here, over 7 inches of rain. So we've got widespread flood warnings, even some flash flood emergencies across these regions this morning. And unfortunately, this continues and actually starting to redevelop. And this is something that you desperately don't want to see. But we've got more heavy rain moving back in these same areas across these regions that just been inundated over the last 6 to 10 hours. So we could be adding another couple of inches of rainfall to these areas that just desperately don't need any, and that will be aggravating the flood risk in these regions. So definitely be on high alert within this area. But out here in the tropics, let's take a look at these temperature anomalies, because these areas have just been almost off the chart. I mean, widespread. I mean, this El Nino is really starting to build and come on with a vengeance. It's continuing to deepen and strengthen. Out here in the Atlantic, all these areas in red, those are well above average sea surface temperature anomalies. It's really kind of hard pressed to find anything technically even below average. And we've got this warm blob up here in the North Pacific that's fueling all the water vapor that's fueled back into the US and adding to those high, if not almost record high heat indices almost on a daily basis. And that's also fueling these thunderstorms. So we've been seeing these numerous areas of isolated pockets of energy producing 2 to 3 inch per hour rainfall rates. And we could have another area that could pick up a foot of rain within a 24-hour period. And we've seen 6 or 7 of those just in the last 7 to 10 days. And it's all complements of just these well above average sea surface temperature anomalies, and it doesn't seem to want to quit. So if you take a look at the chart, and this is pretty concerning, guys, this is the last 30-year mean, folks. So at the beginning of the year, we were above average, but not like off the chart. So the first couple of months, as the El Nino was just kind of getting its act together, and it really started to kind of take shape towards the end of the spring months. But now that we've hit the summer months, this is definitely taken another leg up. And even now, over the past week, it's even taken a further leg up. So now we're getting further away to some of the highest sea surface temperature anomalies we've seen really since records started, going back is what we have record of. So, I mean, this is definitely very concerning. This is what's fueling the heat and fueling these storms within these regions. And I think it actually only gets worse next week as the heat really starts to take over. So for today, though, it's across the south where it has been. It's been draped across the southwest. I mean, Phoenix just keeps adding to those record levels. 118 degrees yesterday, 19 days in a row of 110 plus, and there was just no let up. They could actually go the entire month of July of 110 plus, and that heat just extends into the southeast today. So we're looking at 15, 16 states of just under those heat advisories, excessive heat warnings, heat advisories of 105, 110 plus. We've had 31 fatalities for heat related issues so far this season. And you can better believe that number is unfortunately going to be going up with just this expanding heat and really going to be taking over a good part of the country next week, as we'll go into those details. But for today, we've definitely had to be concerned about further north because we've got some pretty big time hail producer storms that could unfold later on this afternoon, especially across the Minneapolis area. They are under that hatched risk. Could see some of those 2-inch per hour diameter hailstones, and even further south back into Kansas. I mean, we've seen, you know, these areas even in Missouri the other day. We had 5-inch hailstones. I mean, we've seen these numerous massive hailstones come out of the sky just the last couple of months, and it's unfortunately, again, that's a culprit of this El Nino and the higher water content in the atmosphere, and then the heat, and then of course the higher water vapor in the atmosphere just fuels all those mechanisms, and that fuels these thunderstorms. And then heading into tomorrow, as the high slowly starts to retreat just a tad bit further off to the west, that pulls the placement or the line of fire of storms a little bit further south. So areas along portions into the Ohio region, back into the northern periphery of Kentucky will be under the gun to see in some of those damaging wind producers, some of those larger hail producers, and that pulls the storm threat further south into portions of southern portions of the Denver region, and that gets into Dodge City and then sneaks into portions of the Texas Panhandle, but it probably puts on the brakes as we get into the Oklahoma City area. But the heavy rainfall, that's exactly where the placement is going to be. So these areas that have been hit hard over the last couple of days are probably going to be hit hard again as the ridge continues to, you know, just be locked onto the southern periphery. So it's got to go up and over that, right? I mean, storms don't like that heat and sinking air. They want to be gravitating into an atmosphere that's more fueled for their development and continuation. And that's exactly what's going to happen, you know, as we get into your Thursday time frame. And then going into Friday, like I mentioned, that ridge of high pressure starts to back off. So we eventually this backdoor trough kind of takes over and wins the war, if you will, as the ridge of high pressure sneaks off and backs off to the west. That puts the highest probabilities and the highest temperature anomalies across the desert southwest, and that opens some sort of little bit of a cool down. And you'll share some of that cool down from the upper Midwest through some of the southern states, like into Oklahoma, like into eastern portions of Texas, getting into Louisiana, maybe into Mississippi. You'll start feeling that, you know, somewhat cooler air as we get into the heart of summer. And that's actually going to bring a little bit of rain. There's not much moisture the further south you go, because again, it's going to be fighting a lot of dry air the further south it goes. So yeah, you still could get some rain shower opportunities in portions of Oklahoma and Arkansas, getting into northern periphery of Mississippi. But even anything further that, it's going to be hard pressed to squeeze out the atmosphere. And, you know, you're talking 20%, you know, probabilities of activity. And further to the north, up here into the northeast, you're still going to be dealing with some heavier rain. So you still get these spokes of energy that come across the northern periphery of that ridge and slide across the Great Lakes and enter a good part of the northeast and wring out the atmosphere and produce those heavier rains for you guys up there. But there's the setup on Sunday. You can see where the cold front pretty much stalls out right along the I-20, I-30 corridor across the southeast. So, you know, taking advantage of those well above average, you know, temperature anomalies in the Gulf of Mexico, and, you know, just with that upper lift, with this lifting mechanism that you're going to have with the cold front, kind of overturns the atmosphere. And, you know, we had some storm opportunities yesterday in the portions of the Tucson area. I think that actually, you know, kind of gets its act together and begins a little bit more active as we get deeper into the weekend. And so then, and if in anything, it actually could lift a little bit further north into portions of Arizona, and then actually might expand into the New Mexico region as we get into Sunday. But going into next week, it's going to be all about the heat. and not just for the South and the Southwest. It's really going to be starting to expand, and this time for a good part of the Pacific Northwest, a good part of the British Columbia region, and now that's going to filter into our north central states where you haven't really experienced the really intense heat so far this season. You're going to start getting into the action, especially by the time we get into the middle of next week, because the cooler air, any cooler air in the upper levels of the atmosphere will slowly start to fade away. And that's going to be overtaken by this dominating ridge of high pressure that's going to be pulling in from the west. And as it does, the further, as it moves off to the east here, it's going to pull into that Gulf moisture, right? So it's going to tap into that Gulf of Mexico energy, and those now you're talking the 70 dew points get all the way up into Nebraska, into the Dakotas, up into Minneapolis. So you're going to start feeling the higher humidity, and compounding with the ridge, you're going to be under some of these heat advisories and heat warnings in these regions as the ridge of high pressure just really starts to take over and dominate and really start to take over the headlines, not just for the southern plains, not just for the Southwest and much of the West, but now it's going to be sneaking into our north central states, the northern periphery of the United States. And really the only reprieve in any escape, and it's really not even that, you're just not under heat advisories, is the East Coast. But you're still, I think, eventually going to get plenty warm, but probably a week away. And you can definitely see by that next Thursday here, with the actual temperatures, with the widespread hundreds obviously filtering back into Texas, now expanding northbound into Oklahoma, getting into Kansas, getting into Nebraska, getting into Missouri, Illinois, into Iowa, as these hundreds could even sneak as far north as Montana, even into the Dakotas. So you're going into Wisconsin, you start getting into the 90s. Even into Michigan, you go into the upper 90s, right? You go into Pittsburgh, you got 95, right? So you got, even into the East Coast, you got middle 90s. So the heat really starts to take over, especially by the middle of next week. So now let's head out to the tropics, because it's the middle of July. We're going into a little bit more active time in hurricane season. We've had 4 named storms. Right now, this is Don, just kind of sitting out there doing its own thing. It's not going to be impacting anybody. It's going to be still taking the name for a couple more days. But now our eyes aren't turned to a pretty active tropical wave out here into the Atlantic, right? So this is going to continue westbound over the next 7 days. Remember, the National Weather Service now extends it to 7 days instead of 5 days. So this is a 7-day outlook, which 7 days from now, they expect the probability of this tropical wave to start approaching the Lesser Antilles. And so if you look at some of the ensemble guidance, going into the European guidance, they've got a couple of members, right? So you've got a couple of members continue to expand and shift this westbound. This is over a 10-day time span, but notice it does take it actually into the Caribbean. So this is probably something we got to kind of keep an eye on. Nothing to be greatly concerned about right now, but most guidance going forward are somewhat bullish on this little tropical wave trying to kind of hold its own. So by day 7, there's about a 40 to 50% probability this could turn into a tropical depression on the ensemble guidance in about a 7-day time span. So yes, this is definitely something we've got to be, kind of keeping an eye on as it tries to sneak into the Western, Caribbean. And if we continue this guidance, this actually pulls it into Central America. So this is just something we have to be lookout for out of here into the tropics. And if we take it a step further, looking at the vertical velocity view, so obviously sea surface temperature anomalies is just one element of the puzzle for tropical development. And then you got a lot of shear, typically with El Nino, which we typically still have in the Caribbean, but you got to have vertical lift. And if you don't have vertical lift, you don't really have thunderstorms. So if we take a look at the next 45 days on the vertical potential anomaly view, the vertical velocity index, we can actually see these areas in green here, right? That's where you see these upward rising motion air. areas in orange, that's where you see some sinking air. So for the next couple of weeks, right, you actually see more greens showing up on the maps than reds and oranges. So that implies you're going to have a little bit more vertical lift opportunities for the next couple of weeks, extending through maybe the August the 10th time frame. But as we go into more the peak of hurricane season, going really into August 15th through October 15th, that's the meat of the season. That's about over 60% of the probability of storms actually develop within that time frame. So as you can see, as we get into that higher time frame of probability, got a lot of sinking air, right? We got a lot of orange showing up on the map in these areas along to the Atlantic as we get into the middle of August and as we go to the end of August and going into the first part of September. So even though the next couple of weeks looks somewhat active as far as the vertical velocity front goes, it definitely looks less active as you get into the middle of August, going into the end of August going forward. So that's just something we got to keep an eye on as well. So guys, I appreciate you guys watching. Do share this video, definitely hit the like button, as well as subscribe to my channel and catch my next update. Fire protect you before and after storm.